thanks be to timing and UPS deliveries, my new novel arrived on Friday. And we're going to talk about that. And we will do several things. The first is a general look at some writing ideas. And I want to review one concept from last week. I then want to tell you briefly about the 3 novels that I have done and to give you a little bit of a history of those. But I'm going to concentrate mostly on the new love child, the mission trip to San Pedro. We'll talk about that in more detail. And then, because of my academic background, I couldn't resist giving you an assignment. It's a take-home assignment, and it's a midterm exam that you will do on your own at your leisure, if you so choose. It's an optional midterm. So you always have a smart aleck in the class. Okay. Okay, let's move along. This is my view on how my faith influences my writing, and particularly fiction. We're going to be looking at the new novel as well as the other 2 that I've done. If you want to write fiction, the best thing you can do is take 2 aspirins, lie down in a dark room and wait for the feeling to pass. A guy who's written a lot of fiction named Lawrence Block. And then Russell Lines said, every journalist has a novel inside him, which is an excellent place for it. In my case, those novels have escaped. And I do want to emphasize that my whole approach to writing flows out of a journalistic background. I am not a literary writer. And some people who come from a more English background would look at the writing that I do and say, well, this isn't good literature. And I'd agree with them. I'm not writing literature. I'm trying to tell a story, and I do that with a style that is more journalistic. There's no such thing as a Christian novel, no more than there is Christian baking or Christian road construction. Someone you may know, Gordon Jackson. It's really important for me to know that when I approach a novel, I'm trying to write a good novel. I'm trying to write a compelling and interesting story. I'm trying to write a funny story at times, but it's not meant to be great literature, nor is it meant to be a Christian novel. I don't think there is such a thing as a Christian novel. I don't think there's such a thing as Christian road construction. You either do it well or you don't. And if you're doing it well from a Christian perspective, you're doing it to the glory of God. And that's what I hope all of my writing does, even whether it's explicitly Christian in content or not. I've done 3 novels, and I want to go over briefly the genesis and the message that comes from each of them. The first one, which I know many of you have read, thank you, is The Church That Used to Be St. Elmo's, the story of a church that gets an anonymous and an enormous donation of $87 million on condition that it change its name. You never find out why that's an issue. But the main story is, how does this group of Christians respond to this lavish gift, this astonishing act of grace? And the story unfolds when the people begin to have different interpretations of how the money should be spent. The second novel is not an explicitly Christian story. It's a knock on censorship on college campuses. Many of you will have picked up in the media about college campuses, whether they're on the conservative or the liberal side, shutting down speakers or not wanting people to come and present a certain point of view. And censorship is a big deal for me. I grew up, as I think you all know, in South Africa, and I did so at a time when censorship was rampant. The white government was terribly concerned to control several things. One was moral issues. We couldn't see various movies, or they would hack out bits of movies that showed naughty bits. So morality was one concern. Another concern was political content. And they were very sensitive to things that they thought might trouble people and lead to unrest. So censorship has always been an issue for me. And one of the books I did, in fact, this came out the year I retired from Whitworth, is a scholarly work titled Christians, Free Expression and the Common Good. And in here, I argue that of all people, Christians should be the ones championing free expression. And we are people who have been given an enormous amount of freedom by God's grace. We ought to soak that into the culture as a whole. So this novel pokes fun at the way a small campus has a young woman, a first-year student, who hears the word moist in her dorm. And she squirms over that, as many women and teenage girls do, for complicated reasons. They don't like that word. And she asks the president if he can do anything to stop them from saying this word in her dorm. And the president, being very student sensitive, moves ahead with that, and things get complicated. And eventually they ban the word from campus. And if they're going to ban her word, well, they have to ban yours and yours and yours. And the whole thing just spirals and explodes. And it becomes a parable of what to do with balancing people's sensitivities with the rights of free expression on a private campus. Remember, it's a private campus which doesn't have First Amendment protections. There's a big difference between what you could say on the campus at WSU and what you could say at Gonzaga or Whitworth. You do not have those protections. This is the new one, the mission trip to San Pedro too. And I'll talk more about this in a little bit. But I first want to go over some commonalities here. The first point that I want to make is I write only books that I would like to read. So these are stories that haven't been told as far as I know. So I wanted to tell them. And I wanted to be able to say somewhere, someday, oh yes, I read that in a book I wrote. And this is the expanded version of that where I'm telling the whole story. The second thing is a question I get now and again: where did the ideas come from? And the answer isn't easy, but to generalize, I'd say there are two sources. The first is my experience, and the second would be just what pops into my head. So, for example, if I'm working on a novel and I have to introduce a minor character, I'll just make up a name. I've done things like looking on the internet and just seeing a name. So that'll work. Pull that in. And I'll just make up stuff. And somehow, rooted in my experience, plus the imagination, helps me pull the story together. The characters, I tried to write about people I could imagine being real, but I care about them. Just as God cares about every one of us in this room, even though these are fictional people, I need to care about them. I need to treat them as people made in God's image. I need to treat them with respect, even if they're lousy people, even if I dislike them, because there's some negative characters who show up now and again. But I never forget that they are people made in God's image. The writing, I've got two jobs. The first is to make you care about the characters, whether you like them or not. If they're not believable, if what they're doing isn't credible, you're going to lose interest and you're not going to stick with it. And the second thing is to keep you turning to the next page to say, what's going to happen next? Or how is this going to end? And it's a real compliment to me when I saw, as I did on one review, person said, I just had to keep reading to see how this thing finished. That's what I'm hoping for. That's what I'm wanting. Finding a publisher. This is at times the real crapshoot in the writing business, because I've had times where within a matter of weeks, a publisher has said, we're interested, we want to run with this. Have you contracted with anyone else? And you say, well, no, there's been a long line of suitors, but I'll go with you. The other side of that is you can wait and try various publishers. This book on censorship from a Christian point of view would logically fit with a number of Christian publishers. I thought InterVarsity would be interested. I thought Baker would be interested. Maybe Abingdon, maybe Zondervan. All of them not interested. And it took me 8 years to find a publisher for that book. It was a secular publisher, academic organization. They jumped on it within 2 weeks of seeing my proposal. So finding a publisher can be really difficult. With explicitly Christian material, I go to Christian publishers, this one being the exception, that they were happy to go with Christian, and it's very explicitly Christian. They were quite okay doing that. I don't know if they could have made any money off the book, because they've sold so far just on 100 copies. And the reason is the pricing. You don't want to rush out and order 5 copies on Amazon for your friends. They price it at $83 a book. And that's because it's going to academic libraries. And even the academic libraries have tight budgets, which is why there are barely 100 of them. I do get royalties on this, though, when they reach 500 in sales. So I'm waiting. Okay, the marketing is the tough part as well, and trying to find outlets for the books. I've just got a rejection from Auntie's bookstore about my other new book that's come out, the Book of Words that I talked about last week, Meet the Dog That Doesn't SH *T, a book about words, which is a light-hearted romp. It's a funny book, but I think the *T part may have put aunties off, and they don't want to do a reading with that one. So the person that the spokesman who does books, he ignored the Moist novel, and I think he is now actively ignoring me on the new one. So just getting attention in the media is really difficult. So how do I market my books in a Christian way? I think the way anyone else would market their books. There's nothing particularly magical or deeply spiritual about this, except, as I said last week, I hand the book over to God and say, God, this is your book now. Do what you can with it. And if it's going to sell and sell well and get the word out there, that's great. And if it doesn't, I have to say that's okay too. I'm doing these for God's glory, not for mine. Well, not much for mine. But the marketing part is difficult. Okay, a quick review of what we talked about last week, and that's the 5-step writing procedure. I come up initially with the idea for a book. This book, the idea came when I was in Mexico for 4 months in 2016. The fall of that year, I spent as an interim principal at a small missionary school. That was a small school, not one for small missionaries. And it had a lot of spare time as part of the job. I thought, let me do some more writing. I was at that stage revising and finishing the Moist book, but I thought, what is there about missionaries that I can write? And so the idea came about the premise of the mission trip to San Pedro, and I'll talk about that in more detail shortly. But I've got to begin with an idea, and I'm always thinking of possible ideas. Most of them are not going to go anywhere, but I think if an idea might be able to get some traction, I'll make some notes. Now, write something down. And just recently, I had an idea about a certain topic. I got a book on interlibrary loan, read the book, and thought, wow, how could this help me do this? I just set it aside. But the nagging feeling that this may be an idea that has merit hasn't gone away. So I've now ordered that book. I've bought a copy for myself. I'm going to do some more digging and say, what can I do on this topic that is a book that I would like to read? And it's something that's different from the book I've ordered, and it's different from other books that are out there. So maybe it'll go nowhere. And if it does, if it doesn't go anywhere, hey, it's $8 on a book I ordered. That's okay, I can afford that. But the idea is the crucial starting point for any project that I'll commit to. Then I might have to do some research. With fiction, far less so. This book, being a scholarly book, took literally an entire year's sabbatical to research and begin the writing. Hundreds of footnotes in a book like that. Fortunately, in this one, there are 0 footnotes. You're not expecting them in a novel. You don't get them in a novel, typically. Okay? Focus. Well, what exactly are you trying to accomplish? Especially if you've got a lot of data, a lot of ideas, you've got to get clarity on what's coming next. And then you actually begin the writing and you begin drafting the work. And that's where initially a lot of time goes. And sometimes the writing goes very quickly for me. Sometimes it's a real struggle. And one of the things that's a great benefit of having taught writing at Whitworth for 3 decades is I know the tricks. I know what to do if I hit a block and I say, oh no, I'm doomed. I'll never finish this book. No, that's not true. You're as good a writer today as you were yesterday when things were going smoothly. And it's something you've just got to work around, be patient, it'll come together. And then the polishing phase includes 2 parts. One is the work that I'm going to do in polishing, fixing, cutting, adding. And then there's feedback I'm getting from people because I'm sending this out to a number of folks to look at. So what do you think? And sometimes people will come up with typos that I should have caught on my 5th reading of the manuscript, just don't see them. And that's one way readers can help me. Another is with critiquing ideas and saying, this doesn't sound right. 20-year-olds don't talk this way, my son or daughter might tell me. So there's input that I'll get in that way. So let's talk now in more detail about the new novel and the anatomy of the San Pedro book. Grows out of my experience. And this is a somewhat snarky, sarcastic, poking fun at a group of high schoolers and their youth pastor who go on a mission. But it's really important, and I have a note at the end of the book to say, this is not knocking the church, it is not knocking missions. What it is doing, it's critiquing the wrong way of doing missions. And I want to put in a plug here for the work that our church has for a long while done with the El Paso Church in El Salvador, because what our folks are doing is far closer to the right way of doing missions, where you establish a long-term relationship. This story is about a group of high school kids, their youth pastor, and a very nervous chaperone who has never traveled before and has never worked with kids before. And they end up going to this village, which turns out to be the wrong village. Now, how does that happen? It's because their very sweet Christian travel agent didn't know the difference between San Gabriel Airport and Santa Gabriela Airport. And any of you who have any Spanish will know that there's a significant difference. So the whole premise of the book is that these poor folks end up at the wrong village, and instead of going there to help, they are the ones who need help. And everything that can go wrong goes wrong. One of the examples would be something from my experience in South Africa when I was leading a study program. I led 6-month-long trips to South Africa for Whitworth students. And on one occasion, these 3 young women were staying at a host family, and they came and told me that their cash had been stolen, an iPod had been stolen. And we sorted it out. But the thing that was so painful was here they were with host families, and someone in that family had stolen from them. It was an absolute shame and embarrassment, a humiliation for the mom and the dad. Turned out their daughter had taken the money. And that's an incident I bring into the story because that's the sort of thing that can happen in a different kind of setting. Another example came from when I was in Egypt in 2006. I was doing some consulting there for the Anglican Church, and it was a wonderfully vibrant church doing all kinds of ministries. They had lots of volunteers who would come from the States or from Britain. And on one occasion, the bishop sent a young woman to me, and he said, I don't know what to do with her. She was an English girl who'd, with the noblest of motives, come to Cairo to volunteer. And she didn't know what she wanted to do. The bishop didn't know what he could do with her. And I said to him, what you really needed to do in this case was have a job description and match your volunteer to what you needed doing. And that is one of the themes that comes up in this novel, where you've got a group of high school kids and a leader and a chaperone whose Spanish skills are virtually nil. They go there not knowing what exactly they're going to do, except, of course, paint the church and run a vacation Bible school. But they've got no particular skills to engage with this community. It's a community they're going to that they've never met before. And in fact, it's lined up by a matchmaker kind of organization called Mission Matches. And they'll look at your church group and say, okay, we can put you with this church over here. And it's a critique of this way of doing missions, because so many people in poorer countries are terribly vulnerable to the idea that we've got rich Americans coming down. They're going to bring money into your community. Sure, we'll take them. And there's a book that I'd encourage you to read if you have any interest in this whole area, called Toxic Charity. It's a searing indictment of what many churches and many other non-governmental organizations do, where they go into a situation saying, we know what's best for you. We're coming to tell you what to do. We drill wells. We are going to drill a well, whether you need one, whether you want one or not. And the book Toxic Charity tells the story of a church in Mexico whose church was painted 6 times over the course of a summer because of a succession of do-gooder church groups who came and said, you need your church painting. Forget the fact that it was painted 2 weeks ago. We are going to paint your church again, rather than saying to people, what is it that you need that we might be able to help you with over the long term? And that then was my experience that helped shape this story. So the idea was there in a basic form, and I began doing some writing and began thinking, now, who are the main characters here? And clearly the youth pastor is the main protagonist, a great guy. He's wanting to do the right thing. He's in his 2nd year, I think it is, at the church. And before, the church has sent their youth group on mission trips, but it was just to Denver to help with the soup kitchen. Now they're going to go bold. They're going to go international. And it's brave of him. He's never done anything like this before. The church has no experience in doing mission trips outside the country. But I am impressed with this fellow for his faith, for his readiness to take on this kind of challenge. So I care about him. I want to present him in a good, positive light. But he then has to come to terms with the fact, are we doing things the right way? And that's the theme that emerges in the story. The writing, it started out well enough. I remember sitting in the York coffee shop near my home in Puebla, Mexico, with my laptop, beginning to do some writing there. And then I hit a wall. As I told you last week, I got to about page 30 and then said, well, now what? They've arrived in this country, and I'd never say which country it is. It's meant to be generic. And what do we do now? I didn't know. So I just let it sit, left it, and said, I'll get back to this. And eventually I did, and somehow found a way to move things forward, and ended up writing a novel that was similar in length to the first two. Finding a publisher, Christian fiction is difficult to get published because what many of them are wanting are these Amish romance stories. Another is a happy story about the young woman whose heart is broken by her boyfriend who deserts her, but she trusts in the Lord. And by the end of the book, she's now happily married to Joe, who's even better than the first guy. I don't want to write that kind of story. I don't want to write happy ending stories that are just, oh, that's nice. I want to try and deal with some issues that the church is facing with, and how the church does missions is a key concern for me. And this is what the latest book tackles. So finding a publisher who's willing to do hard issue kinds of books is not easy. The publisher who did this, Whitworth and Stock, they're based in Eugene, Oregon. Some of you will know of them. They are very adventurous and they take on a wide range of stuff. I had one other book published by them, which is on the table over there. It's a book of Christian satires, and they were willing to take a risk on that. Sales were dismal, but it doesn't cost them much because they work strictly on a print-on-demand basis. So they don't have 3,000 copies of this book sitting in their warehouse. They'll print when people order. Okay. The marketing. Maybe the less said about that, the better. Okay. 3 final thoughts. According to one writer that I came across recently, fiction is what separates us from the animal world. We can imagine stories. We can tell stories. As far as I know, dolphins, incredibly intelligent though they are, don't tell each other stories at bedtime or any other time of the day. Okay? Human beings made in the image of God are able to tell stories. And that's something that I think is a really powerful reality about our existence as human beings made in God's image. Okay. The ideas can take a long time to germinate or to mature, as I've said several times about that one book. But there are other books that I've had or stories that I've written that I've tried for years to get placed, and they don't get placed. That's okay. I'm grateful for the ones that I have been able to get out there. I'll talk about that in a moment. Ugo Betti was an Italian judge and a playwright, and somewhere he wrote the following: "To believe in God is to know that all the rules will be fair and that there will be wonderful surprises." And that's a quote I came across years ago, and it's one that I've clung to and greatly valued when I'm struggling to market a book. If this book sells no more than 200 copies, so be it. God has got other surprises lined up for me. Just this morning, Sue and I in our devotional reading came across the passage in Genesis where Abraham and Sarah are promised the little boy Isaac. And there's the wonderfully powerful verse, with God, nothing is impossible. And whether we're talking about crises in our lives, the difficulties we may be facing, family issues or job issues or other problems we have, it's helpful to remember the words of a guy like Ugo Betti and to know that with God, nothing is impossible. Which brings me to green tigers and a matter of grace. There's a philosopher named Peter Kreeft, who I assume he's retired now from Boston University, Catholic philosopher and writer, who once spoke about the concept of green tigers. He said, everything that we see around us is something that might not have been. God chose to make orange tigers. If he'd wanted to, he could have made green tigers. Green tigers are things he chose not to do. They are might have beens. If he'd wanted to, he could have made them. If he'd wanted to, he could have made someone else rather than you and me when you were conceived. The miracle of that one sperm meeting that one particular egg made you. Just millimeters off, it would have been a different sibling or a different child that your parents would have had. You might not have been. The green tiger might have been. And so I cling to that statement by him as a remarkable affirmation of grace. The fact that any one of us is here is truly miraculous. And lining that up against whether I can get sales on my book seems such a pathetic issue to worry about something like that or to be concerned about that when I'm overwhelmed by the grace that God has shown by giving me the gift of life, by just making me, by enabling me to be here. So I want to end our thoughts on this with that positive note that whatever our circumstances, it's a miracle that each of us is here. What about you? I mentioned the take-home exam. You thought I might have forgotten. Gary, I wonder if you would help pass these out, please. Okay. And Marty, if you could do some, or Sue, do some on this side, one each per couple, we should be able to do it. I want you to consider doing some thinking about your own story. When you get home today, some of you I know journal, others of you might just want to think about this over a cup of coffee. How is your life story? If we're running short, I can email some to people. Okay. How is your life story like a novel? How is it not like a novel? How is God shaping your story? The fact that you're here today and alive and kicking means your story isn't finished. How is God shaping it? Who are or who have been the main characters in your life story? Okay. What have been the high points and the low points in your story? I heard this from a fiction writer a few years ago who started out in journalism, and he said he wasn't a very good interviewer, but two questions he would use to get people talking were, what was the best day of your life? And what is the worst day of your life? People have those in mind, and you can ask yourselves those questions. And then how will your story continue to generate interest after your final chapter? In other words, we're looking at an obituary. Or if there were an epilogue to your novel, the story of your life, what would the epilogue say? So that's your homework if you choose to do it. Knowing optional assignments as I do, I'm guessing that maybe only one or two, or perhaps 3 or 4 of you will actually do anything with this, and that's fine. But for those 1 or 2 people, it may prove to be a fruitful and an enriching exercise. So I'll send you on your way with that little assignment. But you may have some questions for me, and I am happy to entertain them. Yes, Dave.
If you ask a question or make a comment, if you could make it without your mask, and then if you could repeat it.
Yes, thank you. So any questions from anyone? Don.
So is the San Pedro book available now?
It is, and there are multiple. Oh, repeat the question. In fact, that's a very good question to repeat. Is the San Pedro novel now available? Yes, it is. And it's available at the table over there at the end. $20, 5 of which will go to the scholarship fund for El Paiso. All the books that are on sale there, 25% goes to the scholarship fund. Other questions? Yes.
I'm curious, during the writing process, at what point do you determine the scope and, like the depth of what you're going to go into the story, and when you determine how long it will be,
Okay.
the number of pages?
The question is, in writing a story like this, how do I determine the scope and how deep am I going to go and how long will the story be? I don't know that I can give you an easy answer to that. It's sort of like asking how long is a piece of string? It's long enough. And I let the story unfold. There's every one of these stories has events in it that I never planned to include. So there's a fellow, the father of one of the students in the group, who the group is cut off. They can't communicate with the church back home. And this father gets incredibly agitated. He's very impulsive, and he flies to the country to go and look for his daughter. And it's a complete disaster. And I hope people reading it would find it amusing what happens to him. But he came up as I was writing. I hadn't planned to put him in. I don't say, I've got to write this at 80,000 words, or it's got to be 500 pages. It is what it is, as they say among other cliches. Yes, Craig.
What popular authors that we would know?
So what popular authors that you might know would I recommend?
That you enjoy to write?
Oh, I don't read a lot of current popular fiction. And I've asked myself, do I try to style my writing on anyone? And the answer is no, I need to avoid that. I don't want to copy anyone. You've got to be your own voice. But if there's anyone who's sarcastic writing I admire, it would be the English writer Evelyn Waugh. And some of you may have read his stuff. Some of his satires are absolutely brutal. And one of them, which is in fact similar to some of the things I've written, is about a newspaper that sends a correspondent to cover a war in Somalia. This is written in the 20s or the 30s. And there's a mix-up as they're trying to make the assignment, and they send their gardening correspondent. And the whole story flows from that mistaken issue. So this novel comes also from a mistake that someone makes. And then if you accept that premise, the whole book hinges on that. So to answer your question again, Craig, I don't think I can speak to any particular authors. Yeah, I jump around. Sue is a voracious fiction reader. And now and again, she'll say to me, you've got to read this one. And I do usually listen to her and end up. I'm not going to repeat that. So it's a real range of contemporary fiction. Anyone else? Yes.
I heard writers say that the story is within them, throws out. Was that part of your writing experience?
The question is, she's heard writers say that the story is in them and it just flows out. Has that been my experience? Not really. I would come up with an idea and then I've got to make the idea work. Some writers do a lot of outlining and they will be meticulous about 3x5 cards with all the scenes, doing a book in the way Alfred Hitchcock did movies. He knew exactly what was going to happen at each stage of the movie. Other writers, I think, are much more spontaneous, and I see myself in that category. And we'll just see what happens. Yeah. Yes.
Inspiration and idea. I heard a story once that when Stephen King was asked where he got the inspiration for his books, that his answer was, I have the heart of a small boy and I keep it in a jar on my desk.
Okay. Sherry was commenting on a remark that Stephen King once made about getting ideas. And he said he has a heart of a small boy and he keeps it on his desk. Yes, Dave.
I'm going to read one from NJ, who's online.
Yes.
She says, Gordon in last week's session inspired me to dig out an old story I wrote 10 years ago. I tend to lean toward fables, as in Aesop's fables, with a moral or value noted at the end. This story uses Galapagos tortoises to make the point that even though someone may be different, they have a talent and have value. Her question is, do you have any advice about writing children's stories about illustrations? And this is going on, that is written online, so you don't have to repeat the question.
Okay. Any advice for writing children's stories? No, that's not an area that I've been involved in. There are so many subspecialties in writing that I know only academic books to some extent, and then Christian self-help type books or fiction. I'm beginning to get some experience there. But sorry, MJ, thank you for tuning in, but I wish I could give you better counsel. Yes, Sarah.
I wonder if you would write a notebook or a file that you stash things in, hear something or see something. As a teacher, we encourage the older
Mhm. Sarah asked if I keep a writer's notebook to log ideas that come up. And the answer is yes, I do. Just yesterday, I was jotting down some thoughts on a particular idea, the one for which I've ordered that book, and that will go into the file. So I have a file of ideas that are somewhat developed, and then other files for just whimsical ideas. Could this be a book, perhaps? And maybe I'll come back to it, but most likely not. The others that are a bit more fleshed out, those could be developed into a full book. And some better known authors will work with a publisher in advance, and they will perhaps get a cash payment, even though the book isn't close to being finished. I remember Stephen King, whose name was mentioned a moment ago, I think his first real novel, he got an advance of $200,000. I got a couple of advances years ago on some of my earlier books, and haven't smelled one since then. Publishers are now in a much more brutal environment than they were 20 years ago. And they can't afford to pay advances unless you have a name like Stephen King or Danielle Steele. Maybe I should change my name. Yes, Rick.
Have you had any students that have gone on to write novels or authors that maybe come back to you for advice?
Have I had any students who've gone on to write novels and have come to me for advice? Well, if any have gone on to those levels of writing, I don't know about them. And maybe they knew not to come to me for advice. Okay. Maybe one or two more questions. Oh, yes.
You mentioned a couple of minutes ago about the publishing field is getting more competitive or brutal. Could you say that that there's more of them, or the profit motive is more strict?
In what ways, the question is getting at, is the publishing industry becoming more competitive? What are the reasons there? The one thing would be the internet and how anyone can go out there and publish anything. If I wanted to put my books out there as self-published things, which I've done for 2 books of quotations, one of which is on the sale table there. It's, I think, a delightful collection of paradoxes and whimsical contradictions and so on. I self-published that. I was struggling to get a publisher for that. So I thought, hey, why don't I try? Disaster. The word for marketing, or the M for marketing, is the issue there. Why else? Publishing has always been incredibly competitive. John Steinbeck said that book publishing makes horse racing look like a solid industry. Betting on horses would be a better bet than going into publishing. And I'll tell you 2 stories about publishing. Some of you know the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. The fellow who wrote that went to 125 publishers before someone picked up on it. And then it became this international bestseller, and you had 124 other publishers saying, well, duh, we blew that one, didn't we? And then there's a writer, a Polish-born writer, Jerzy Kosinski, and he won a National Book Award for one of his novels. And with permission of Kosinski and the publisher, an English grad student rewrote the book, sort of. It was very thinly disguised, changed the names of the book, the characters, but submitted essentially the same book, which had won a national prize, to a whole bunch of publishers. All of them turned it down. And some of them just didn't respond. Others said, well, this has some potential, but it could use these changes. So book publishing at even the highest levels is very unpredictable. And every publisher hopes that this next one is going to be a bestseller. Publishers like Wipf and Stock have a broader vision than that. They're concerned to get out Christian books that they know may sell only 100 copies. They're okay with that. That's part of what they do. So I hope that gives you a bit of a sense of how it's terribly competitive. And if any of you are thinking of getting stuff published, please don't go anywhere near what are called vanity publishers, who will take $5,000 from you, do a cursory edit of your book and put it out, and you end up sitting with 1,000 copies in your garage that no one's ever going to buy. If you do want to do something like a family memoir, there are ways to get that self-published at no cost to yourself. And I'm working with another organization now on a set of devotionals that I wrote for them. They're going to publish that, or we will publish that through an Amazon subsidiary. And all we pay for is the printing costs of the book and a small profit margin for Amazon. And you then get the book as many copies as you want or as few as you want. So if you've got 20 members in your family to whom you want to distribute Grandpa's memoirs, it costs you nothing to get into that. You don't want to go anywhere near a publisher that's going to sting you for $5,000. Okay, well, thank you very much for being here, and I will go to the table there in case you have any interest in San Pedro or any of the other books.
Thank you.
Gary, could you help undo me here, please? Okay, and then I need to get this off
Hi, Doris.
without doing my hearing aids any harm. Oh,
Hi, Marty.
I don't see any hearing aids attached, so I think that was successful.
not bad.
Is this Dave's?
Yes, yeah, or somebody's.
I don't think they can hear us.
I think we're done now.
Yeah.
Is anybody there?
Peggy.
Hi, Peggy. Nope. Turn it off before the full. Oops, too late.
Okay.